What if Mariah Carey was a 90s alternative rocker? That's the scenario we'll be unpacking on this week's What If, How, When, Why. Hello, my name's Morgan Brown, and each week I upload a new What If video to my YouTube channel. The idea of these videos is that every week I pick a different popular song and imagine an alternative universe scenario in which a change of circumstances causes that song to come out completely different from the version that we know and love. I then take the original lead vocal of that song and record a new backing track to it in order to bring this alternative version of the song to life. So the track I picked this week was Always Be My Baby by Mariah Carey, and I tried to turn that into a mid-90s alternative rock style song. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, here's a little taster. I must admit, growing up, Mariah Carey's music was pretty much the antithesis of everything that I liked in popular music. I was definitely a rock kid, growing up with rock and roll, metal, and then getting into punk as I got into my teenage years. I liked some soul music, but very much the 60s, early 70s kind of classic soul sound, and to me, what I was hearing from Mariah Carey didn't sound remotely like soul music. It was only really years later, as her sound developed, as you learnt more about who she was and her struggles in the industry, and just as I grew up a bit as well, I've definitely developed rather more of an appreciation of her talent and her artistry, and also of how she was manipulated by the industry, and maybe some of those artistic choices you're hearing on those early records weren't really what she would personally have done herself, given the opportunity to express herself completely freely. I think what I heard in those early records that I particularly didn't like was the result of her being classified very early on by a label as adult contemporary, which is a label I didn't really know at the time. Unlike soul music or R&B, adult contemporary isn't really a genre. It's not a kind of music you'd necessarily aspire to make. It's not something that organically formed. It's really just an industry term. It's a way for radio stations and record companies to group together products to make them into a marketable commodity, I guess. So it was a huge thing in popular music, particularly in the late 80s, early 90s. It still exists to this day, but really at that time, an awful lot of the charts was dominated by this adult contemporary stuff. It's a category that crosses genre boundaries, so could be the glossier side of soul or R&B, it could be the softer side of rock, it could be the smoother end of jazz, just the edges of any genre where it becomes smooth and unchallenging and easy listening and mass marketable. And that's definitely how Sony saw Mariah Carey from very early on. And I don't think that's necessarily how she saw herself. She was definitely keen follower of popular music trends. She was aware of what young listeners were listening to. She was definitely aware of what black listeners were listening to. And she was certainly, of her own accord, trying to write songs and to make music that reflected those trends. But I think Sony, and particularly Tommy Mottola, who was both her boss and then became her husband, heard that huge belting voice, saw this attractive young woman who was black enough to appeal to some black audiences, but nowhere near black enough to be off-putting to middle-of-the-road white audiences as well. And they just figured, oh, here's someone who we can slot very neatly into that adult contemporary market and make millions of dollars. So instead of making music for people of her own age, her own background, she was shoehorned into making this adult contemporary stuff, which I guess your adult contemporary consumers may have come up listening to other forms of music. They might have been into harder rock, they might have been into more cutting edge soul or R&B, but by the time they fall into that adult contemporary bracket, they're generally a little older, a little more affluent, they're kind of settling down, getting a bit more middle of the road, but they've got the disposable income. And that's absolutely the market that Mariah Carey was sort of laser focused on by the label. And I guess she was just kind of swept along by the whole thing. Initially wasn't in any position to put up much of a fight against this, and it was bringing a tremendous success, so she didn't question it. By the mid-90s, she's this unbelievably huge star, and is starting to get a little bit frustrated by how little control she has over a lot of these creative decisions, given the fact that it's her songwriting and singing talent that is bringing this corporation and this very controlling husband all these millions. And it wasn't until years later, when her autobiography came out, that we eventually found out about this interesting thing that went on while she was making the Daydream album in 1995, where just as a way to do something that was just for herself and a way to let off steam and give vent to some different creative urges that weren't allowed in her regular career. While making that album, she'd work on the main sort of album tracks throughout the day, but then of an evening, her and the musician she was working with would swap over to recording these parodic alternative rock songs that she was working on, that she'd just been doodling out in her spare time. Just a really fun way to let her hair down, do something completely different. I think she describes it in the book as making fun of the kind of breezy grunge or punk light alternative rock singers who were making their way onto the radio at the time. So she was obviously listening to at least the mainstream end of some other kinds of music that were going on at the time. And according to, I think there's an interview with a guitarist on those sessions, Gary Cirimelli, he also said that she was listening to things like Hole and Garbage and Sleater-Kinney at the time, which, suggests a fair amount of involvement in that kind of music too, particularly Sleater-Kinney, who in 1995 were pretty underground. You had to really be paying attention to know they even existed back in those days. So she was making this record secretly and not with any intention to do anything with it particularly. It was just a fun thing for her and her bandmates to do during kind of downtime. I think after a while she started to think, well, some of these songs are actually quite fun. Maybe we could release this record under an assumed name, just pretend it's some unknown band and just kind of pop this out. But Sony were having none of it. They were really unimpressed with this idea, didn't want to risk tarnishing the reputation of their golden goose singer. So eventually, the only way Mariah could get the record released was to get one of her friends to overdub all the lead vocals on it. Allegedly, it's still got some Mariah Carey backing vocals on. And that record eventually came out under the name Chick. It's an album called Someone's Ugly Daughter. Didn't really do anything. Sony had no interest at all in promoting it. They were just really putting it out to humour Mariah Carey. So it kind of sank without a trace. And it was only, as I say, 5 years ago when Mariah's book came out that she let slip that she had recorded this album, and then all of a sudden all these remaindered copies of it became massive collector's items. So yeah, I thought it was interesting that during this time when her career was being so tightly controlled, she turned to alternative rock as a way of expressing her frustration with the lack of creative control. And I guess it was quite soon after that that she started to make much bolder moves into hip-hop and R&B territory and really started clawing some creative power back, which eventually led to both the breakup of a relationship with Tommy Mottola and with Sony, and then eventually finding a new deal where she could really decide on her own direction. But yeah, the Chick album, it's an interesting one, definitely. It's all up on YouTube to listen to now, if you want to check it out. You can definitely tell that it was kind of just thrown together for fun. Quite a few of the tracks feel more like demos than like completely finished products. But some of the songs are actually pretty good. I particularly enjoy the more Bradley pop punk songs on there. Definitely worth a listen. It's pretty good fun, and I would love to one day hear the version with Mariah singing lead vocals. But yeah, it's funny that Mariah should break out of the boredom of being forced into the industry-created category of adult contemporary by making an alternative rock record, because alternative rock, of course, really is another industry-created box. Just like adult contemporary, it's a marketing term rather than a real genre. I guess it was probably first coined sometime in the late 80s by industry publications like Billboard, just as a way to categorize the various small subgenres of music that didn't seem to fit into the mainstream rock category. They were reaching a different audience. They were being played by different radio stations. So I guess the industry types felt like they needed their own category to group all this stuff together. And certainly after Nirvana had their big major label breakthrough, which was the culmination of several years of the major labels trying to break one of these popular indie bands through to the mainstream, there was a bit of a rush to capitalize on that, and a bit of a signing frenzy, snapping up popular acts from the underground scene to try and replicate that mainstream success of Nevermind. But a lot of these different bands came from different subgenres, and the industry doesn't like that. This band's grunge, this band's industrial, this band's punk, this band's goth. And each of these movements has a loyal following, but it's not something that the major label industry can understand on the kind of scale they operate on. So the solution is to just group all of these subgenres together and just give it one label so we can just push all of this stuff into this one bracket and just shove it out en masse. So that's alternative rock. For better or worse, that became this widely used term, even though I'm sure none of the original people who were considered to be alternative rock would ever have branded themselves that. In fact, there's a great record by the old East Bay punk group Mr. T Experience called Alternative Is Here to Stay, which is a hilarious take on the old Danny and the Juniors Rock and Roll Is Here to Stay, making fun of the idea that anyone would ever celebrate this ridiculous label alternative. But after a few years of various bands being snapped up and pushed into the mainstream, you do start to get artists coming through who don't actually come from that independent subculture background. They're starting from this major label industry position, but their music draws on these various styles that have been grouped together as alternative. And I guess that, to my mind, when someone says alternative rock, that's the sound that I'm hearing. I'm hearing Alanis Morissette and Bush and Stiltskin. I guess what sets these acts apart is that their music is a reaction to a commercial trend rather than something that's being created as a result of a devotion to a genuine kind of subculture. And for me, that's what alternative rock will always mean. The Mr. T Experience weren't wrong. Alternative is here to stay. It's a label that's stuck even decades after all this stuff went completely mainstream. And you know, now alternative rock isn't the alternative to anything. It's still a term that gets thrown about. But yeah, that leads us back to this week's alternative universe scenario, which is simply that in my alternative timeline, Mariah and her band are recording Daydream just as they do in our timeline, and she's recording these nice kind of smooth R&B tracks in the day, goofing off and recording loud rock tracks at night. But it's in the daytime, they're working on the arrangement of Always Be My Baby, and while they're just having a bit of a playthrough, Gary Ciramelli accidentally treads on his distortion pedal, unleashing this barrage of power chord noise across this track, and the other band members just kind of playing along, change up what they're playing, so the drummers suddenly starts hitting this harder beat, and next thing you know, they've got this whole rockin' version of Always Be My Baby going, and Mariah's hearing this, and she's completely delighted with it, and starts singing along with it, and within no time she decided that actually this version of the song sounds so much better than the arrangement we were working on, so they completely abandoned trying to do it as this nice pop R&B song, rework it as a driving alternative rock song, and all of this is much to the horror of Sony. But Mariah puts her foot down. She's like, no, this is the direction we're going in now. This is what we're doing. So Sony have no choice but to release it. But as luck would have it, Mariah's fans, the Lambs, absolutely adore this new direction and lap it up. And more surprisingly, quite a number of rock fans who previously rejected Mariah Carey just out of hand actually find they quite like it too. So it becomes a big hit and helps to spark a whole new wave of alternative rock that also has powerful, soulful vocals as well. So in order to try and convert Always Be My Baby into an alternative rock track, as ever, my first step is just taking Mariah's isolated vocals, dropping them into GarageBand and getting them synced up, and then just setting the tempo. I think I did speed the tempo up a bit, and then obviously I made the whole rhythm kind of double time as well. Programmed the drums on, aiming for that sort of major label pop punk kind of feel, so punky drive, but the kind of playing that sounds like it's played by a bit of a session pro, so nothing too scrappy, all very tight. Added some bass, which mainly just keeps nice and solid and professional, locked in with the kick drum and playing a lot of solid root note stuff, but I did go for a couple of more ambitious swoops up the neck as I get a bit further along as well, just to liven things up. And guitar-wise, there are quite a few. There's two main rhythm guitar tracks that run all the way through, just panned left and right with a fairly overdriven sound, blasting away on chords throughout. And then when we get to the choruses and the really loud bits, I've got a second pair of guitars with a bit more of a distorted, gnarly, grungy sound that come in over the top of those just to thicken things up and make it a little bit rowdier. And then there's a fifth guitar which has a relatively clean sound but with a fast, quite heavy chorus sound on, which crops up playing a few different bits. And then just for a bit of extra colour, add in a few little touches of an analog synth sound. I think after the synthesized excesses of the 80s, digital synths kind of very much fell out of favour in 90s rock. Just felt like a bit of a throwback to the overly glossy, big 80s production values. But you did start to hear quite a few alternative rock bands using these more retro 70s synth sounds. It crop up in things like Weezer records, that sort of thing. So I thought I'd just throw a little bit of that on there too. And then for the video, as usual, I've started by finding just a decent performance of Mariah doing the song from around the time it came out. And I mixed that in with some mid-90s footage of Veruca Salt playing at a festival because I wanted her to have a suitably rocking looking backing band rather than the very polite session music she's got in the original footage. And just to reflect the lyrics, I've intercut some bits of one of my favourite 90s cartoons, Daria, replaying some moments in the doomed will they won't they romance between Daria and Trent, which I thought just adds a bit of 90s ambience to things and reflected the lyric reasonably well. And also, just to complete the 90s alt rock experience, we have to have some crowd surfing going on, so got some decent crowd surfing footage, including one mad guy who's crowd surfing with a GoPro, so you get the crowd surfer's eye view a bit there too. And then just a final finishing touch, as usual, mocked up a bunch of 90s concert posters to put Mariah into that 90s alt rock context as well. I hope you enjoyed this one. I mean, I love this kind of mid-90s major label alt rock nonsense, so I had a lot of fun doing that. And I always think it sounds cool having fairly driving guitar rock with that kind of massive soulful vocal over it. I feel like it's an underused combination really, so I was really happy with how it turned out, to be honest. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Also, if you did enjoy it, please like and subscribe. It really helps the channel along. If there's anything you'd like me to try my hand at in coming months, any songs you'd like me to have a go at, any artists you'd like me to investigate, or any genres you'd like me to try my hand at, please do let me know. But otherwise, that's all from me for this week, so thanks very much indeed for watching, and I will see you next time.